I'd like to invite everyone to come in and grab a seat so we can get started. We'd like to start on time, please. 2:33. So, at the conclusion of Dr. Larson's presentation, a URL address and a QR code will appear on the screen for 15 minutes. Those of you in attendance here live will also see one of these forms as you exit after 3:30. You must remain until the end of the program in order to receive certificates of continuing education. Those links will take you to the evaluation that's online. So please enter that URL address. There's also a QR code. You can use your smartphone to aim it at that QR code, and it will open in a web browser with a link to the form. That will be live at 3:30. A certificate of completion will be sent to your email within 7 days of the completion of the evaluation. So, we will now resume our educational activity, and here to introduce today's final speaker is Jewish Hospice and Chaplaincy Network Chief Executive Officer, Rabbi Joseph Krakoff.
Hello again, everybody. Wonderful to be back with you as we conclude our conference with our speaker, who is your batting cleanup today. I don't know if you realize that or not, but Dr. Larson is no stranger to our conference. In fact, this is his 5th time speaking at our conference. Now, if this were Saturday Night Live, Dr. Larson, they would give you a 5-timer's jacket. So I was looking for a jacket for you, and this is all I could find behind the stage. So if you want it, it's yours. Dr. Larson is an endowed professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University, clinician and researcher and fellow in 3 divisions of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Larson has been a pioneer in hospice and palliative care, conducting research, training, and lectures throughout the world. His work on grief counseling, stress and health professionals, and self-concealment has been widely cited. He received the Association for Death Education and Counseling Death Educator Award in 2016, has been recognized as an innovator of hospice and palliative care by the National Hospice Foundation in 2018. His insightful and inspiring vision of end-of-life work, combined with his ability to translate theory and research into effective clinical practice, has made him an extraordinarily popular national and international speaker, hence coming back to us for a 5th time. Please join me in welcoming home Dr. Larson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and it is a real joy and an honor to be with you all here again. It is a very special conference. It has always had special meaning to me, but I think it has particularly special meaning in these times. We've all been running around trying to get vaccines. We've been looking for boosters, but let's reflect for a moment. Hasn't this been absolutely the best booster we could have had for ourselves right now? And I think we should give Rabbi Friedman and Cheryl and the planning committee and everyone else who's worked so hard to make this happen in these difficult times a big round of applause. And it's important when we're talking about our times to reflect a little bit on what we've gone through, because I'm going to be talking about resilience and how we can go forth on our helping journeys. But to really understand that, we have to look at what's happened recently. And I think we all know all too well that the COVID pandemic has been a seismic psychological, social, and health shockwave throughout our world. It's added to environmental grief that we're experiencing. It's added to political grief, economic grief, It's disrupted the normal rhythms of life. It is absolutely a world-changing event. It has had an impact that is extraordinary. In February of 2020, I remember when we were shutting things down, a childhood movie. Some of us who are more experienced would remember The Day the Earth Stood Still, that 1953 movie. When Gort and Klaatu came to the Earth and said, we're going to reduce the Earth to a cinder if you don't stop all your aggression, and we don't want it to come into outer space. And in that movie, they shut off all the electricity on the planet, and everything stopped. And I thought of that movie because I was driving over to a mall. There's no one there. I'm on the streets. They're empty. And I had two thoughts about this. The first thought was, wow, the entire planet has had what we call an ego chill experience, that sudden shudder that stems from the awareness that non-being is absolutely possible. My second thought was, well, welcome to our world, the rest of the world. And I mean the world of hospice, palliative care, and bereavement, because we've been living there all these years, very aware of the fragility of life and the meaning of grief and the struggles with loss. So one of the conclusions I've come to, and what I'm hoping this leads to, is the message is going to be to the world and to us is, who are you going to call? All of you, all of us. Because we have the models, the skills, the ideas that can take us forward in this new reality that we're experiencing. Now, I'm going to be talking about caregiving, but more in a professional context. I think the presentation on caregiving this morning by Jessica was just phenomenal and really highlighted the real physical and psychological demands of family caregiving, and something that really needs to be given more focus. And also, we've learned about the messages that come from pain. The pain can teach us so much and can be transformed into compassion, and that's a theme that I'm going to develop. But this pandemic has kept us apart, and I want to begin with just a look at that, because it's so important to understand what's happened in our world. The social physical distancing, self-quarantining, isolation, the experiences we have socially now. The loneliness. You know that loneliness is a better predictor of mortality than smoking? And how many of us have felt lonely in the last few years? Raise our hands. If we've had an experience of loneliness, yeah, it just is rampant, and it's rampant in younger people who are really just so needy of developmental experiences, the young people who are not having the kinds of developmental context that they need. We have a new normal, and researching this, we look at something called the COVID stress syndrome, and here are some of the items: fear of contamination, worry about finances, xenophobic fear that foreigners are spreading the virus, traumatic stress symptoms associated with the exposure to the virus, compulsive checking and things like that that are not at all normal for us. I have an acronym I've coined for a new disorder that I think we all have to a certain extent: SCARED, Situational Coronavirus Activated Relational Disorder. Yeah. And I think I'm going to submit it to DSM-6. If you have it for 12 months or more, then you have PSD, Prolonged Scared Disorder. But it's that queasy, uncomfortable feeling you have around others now. That is impactful on us and our social connections. So there's a profound and pervasive experience, I believe, of grief, loss, and trauma, reshaping, I believe, who we are and how we live, how we die, how we grieve now and in the future. When we look at grief and bereavement, I've been part of a group that's done a lot internationally trying to support hospice programs and palliative care programs around the world during this COVID experience. And you can see the kinds of messages that we're sending out, acknowledging that grief and bereavement in the COVID pandemic era is different, and this is familiar to all of you doing this work. We have disbelief or difficulty in coping with a loved one's death because you're not able to be there, you're separated. We have individuals who may feel guilt and remorse about unwittingly having transmitted the disease. Family members left in this liminal state, they don't know what's going on. Lack of compassionate physical touch, which is at the heart of our work, compassionate person-centered care. We're high touch. And to have that taken away is very, very difficult and challenges us as caregivers. Social networks are crucial in managing bereavement, and now they're diminished, and that is having a huge impact. So grief is different. Grief will be more complicated. We're estimating that 0.5 to 1 million people will have more complicated grief as a result of this pandemic. And it's not just people who lost someone to COVID, it's everyone who's lost someone, because everyone had to deal with dying, their loved one dying during this pandemic with these different conditions. I think the novel coronavirus has created a novel form of traumatic bereavement we're going to be dealing with for a long, long time. When we look at stressors for us, for clinicians, you have self-care practices being undermined. The last presentation telling us self-care is really important. Well, self-care has been made more difficult. All the things that we do, and some of them that I'll be talking about in a few minutes, have been undermined by this pandemic. Work overload. Cumulative loss and exposure to repeated trauma are common in the care of COVID-19 patients and all patients during this time. There was a survey of end-of-life clinicians, and they said, well, what are your number one stressor? What's your number one, number two stressor? They said number one was work overload, which I think is familiar to everybody here. But also, the second was no time to grieve. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Isolation of staff from their own family members prevents provision of critical social support. So you don't get the kind of support maybe you did in the past, especially if you're working directly with COVID patients earlier in the pandemic, particularly. Disruption of team members' roles. How many of you are on a team? You work with others on a team. Hasn't it changed? Isn't doing Zoom team meetings different? Doesn't that cut down on our communications, on those personal connections, on the conversations in the hallway where we say, hey, I'm having a struggle with this, or can you help me with this? It's a little hard to squeeze that into a Zoom room. You're doing telemedicine, you're doing teletherapy, you're talking through a computer. I was interviewed for the Los Angeles Times article, and the minister who was there in the interview said, because he's doing teletherapy or telemedicine, he said, the grief is pouring into my living room. So we're living at work, essentially, aren't we? And if you're doing things via computer at home, you know what I mean about boundary setting, how difficult it is. Caregivers can feel guilty taking time away from the clinical environment to restore themselves when others are working even longer hours. Physical strain. It's just a huge number of stressors that have come with the COVID pandemic. Now, we're all familiar with burnout and secondary traumatic stress, I think, and moral distress, but they are skyrocketing. The research is showing that burnout levels are off the charts. And burnout has these three components you're all familiar with. Demoralization, the sense I can't do well at doing good. The second component is I'm feeling a little bit disconnected, diminished caring. I'm not feeling as connected. I'm feeling a little more cynical. Caring for all these patients. Why are they here? What are we doing about this? And then moral distress. And the absolutely most dramatic example of moral distress is triaging ventilators. What a terrible situation for any health professional to be making a decision about who's going to survive and who's not going to survive. So, and it's important to remember this pandemic has been a perfect storm, but we're in different boats in the storm, so that disadvantaged communities, minority communities have suffered the most. And that is going to be an enormous issue to deal with, and it's revealed all the fault lines in our healthcare system and all the things that we really need to address in the future. Now, when we look at stress, there's some good news, is that we're learning more about how we can monitor stress in ourselves. Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF has studied telomeres and has written extensively about this. And these telomeres are these nucleoproteins that are on the tips of our chromosomes. And what they do is they prevent replicative senescence. They basically prevent aging. So if your telomeres are getting shorter, that's not good, because that correlates with all the diseases of aging and cancer, and it's something you really want to prevent. But stress has an impact on telomere health. Elizabeth told me, she came to our campus and I had a luncheon with her, and she said that they did a study with meditators and found that just 16 weeks of meditation actually improved telomere health. So that was kind of encouraging. So you can impact things at a cellular level, and that's kind of where I'm leading here, as I'm going to begin talking about resilience-enhancing strategies. You may probably I'd say maybe a few years, you could have your telomeres measured at Walgreens and CVS. I'm not sure about that. Elizabeth said something's coming. The other piece is that we are wired to be altruistic. And I think this is really, really important. We have these mirror neurons that are allowing us to have this complementary neural activity, affective neural activity. And when we do like functional MRI studies, what we find is that if you score high on self-report measures of empathic capacity, you have stronger activations in the mirror neuron system. And as Rabbi Friedman was saying, you are not normal. You are more empathic. This is an empathic, caring group. And honestly, I've done work with our population, and you score higher on measures of empathic capacity. And there's good news there, and there's difficult news. And I always cite the study by Ezra Stotland, who found that nurses who scored the highest on a measure of empathic capacity were the first to leave the room of dying patients. They did the proverbial U-turn at the foot of the bed of the dying patient. But after they received supervision and training and support, they became the most effective nurses, as judged by researchers, patients, coworkers. So empathy is a double-edged sword. Similarly, what brought you into the work is going to be a double-edged sword, because it's what can make you an absolutely fabulous helper, but it also defines what's going to be stressful for you, because it matters to you. Your work matters to you. And I'm going to come back and try to convince you or show you that we're learning that staying connected to and living out our purpose in the work can be one of the best stress buffers as well. Now, what I want to frame this as is we have to meet the challenge of caring. And what I put it as is finding a way to be emotionally involved, because I believe we have to be emotionally involved in our work. People don't care what you know till they know that you care. And you have to be in there as a person in your work to maintain your helping motivations, empathy, compassion, and commitment as you courageously, and yes, this work is courageous, help people live with hope in a world in which loss is inescapable. You know, there's been this call for this kind of compassionate, person-centered care in healthcare and counseling for a long, long time. And it's the call for that is building each day. We're learning more and more about it. What we know, though, is that person-centered care, patient-centered care, biopsychosocial plus spiritual care, whole person care require your whole person. Whole person care requires your whole person. It requires, and here's where the difficulty or challenge lies, being fully present to suffering. That's challenging, to be fully present to suffering. Having difficult end-of-life conversations, you've all been there. You know how difficult those curative to palliative conversations are, how absolutely challenging they are. And we've learned a lot about how to do those conversations, but we have to have the courage to have them and the skills. Being a team member, being a team member requires a kind of vulnerability. It's a situation where you can grow tremendously, but also you'll have some scars. In fact, Balfour Mount said, if you don't have any scars, you haven't been on a team. We all know this. We bump into each other in different ways. Feelings are hurt. We're trying to do the best job we can. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we know about healthy teams and resilient teams today. You have to find a way to revise your own assumptive world. What kind of world am I living in where these kinds of tragic things can happen to people? Sometimes it happens, don't you find, like one after the other, and you say, is there no relief for this family? Could this be happening now? And I could give you, just from my own experience, 25 examples of that, where I just struggle with it. How could this be happening to this family after that's happened? And you have to find a way to maintain your commitment to the work. One of the questions I would ask is, if you could go back and not do what you're doing and change your career, and right now it would be probably the time that you're most challenged, how many of us would stand up? Raise your hand if you say, I would continue doing this even though it's difficult. I wouldn't stop if I, look at the hands. That's really, yeah. And that's important, isn't it? Because that's what can carry us forward. Diana Fosha said this, a little sidebar on courage. Diana Fosha said, the therapist must be courageous and the client must be safe. I think that's a nice statement. Also, something I've never talked about here, my relationship with Carl Rogers, I did some great things with Carl, and I asked him once, again, the more experienced people in the room will remember the Rogers, Pearls, and Ellis films. Does anybody remember those? Remember, some of you, oh, you didn't remember. Well, anyhow, he had a training film that I grew up on with Gloria was the client. So it was Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, and the other fellow, and Albert Ellis. And I asked him when I was with him, I said, well, what happened with Gloria? And he said, well, and in the film, she was asking him for advice over and over again, and he said, no, I can't give you advice about this situation in your life. And she wrote to him and said, about 8 years later, I guess, and said, my son just died of leukemia. He wrote back and said, I'm so sorry to hear that. 15 years later, she wrote and said, I have cancer and I'm trying to decide about chemotherapy, and it was a quality of life, length of life kind of decision. And he wrote back, well, Gloria, again, I can't really make this decision for you. It's a very personal decision. But I can say, and this is the line that is in my mind always when I'm working with patients in difficult situations, whatever choice you make, it will be a courageous one. So that's kind of I'll share that with you as a gift from Carl, because I think it's so true in these life situations. Okay, so what can we do? First, remember or know, resilience is not a trait. It's not like you are resilient, you're not resilient, and thus you're in trouble and you're going to do fine. Resilience is an outcome. It's an outcome we can shape, we can determine, we can impact. And there are identified resilience-enhancing strategies that make a difference, that are empirically validated. Now, many of these are very familiar to you. Mindfulness, how many of you have heard a lot about mindfulness recently? Yeah, almost everybody in the room. Well, that's, John Kabat-Zinn's notion, and he developed that in Massachusetts, and now it's spread throughout the human services and psychotherapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBSR, et cetera. But it is a wonderful practice, and what it really involves is getting a little distance from our experience so we can actually just see ourselves and what's going on and not dive in. And get that little bit of distance, a little bit of a witness to see what's happening, so we're not diving into negative experience, but we're learning from it, and we're learning from positive experience as well. Also centering us as helpers, so we're having those difficult conversations with patients and families. We're able to be centered. We're able to really be present. So I think that's the role of mindfulness. It's not a therapy in itself. It's a practice that we can bring into our work. Exercise. How many of us exercise regularly? Raise our hands. Okay, now I've got a question for you guys. How many of you would give up all your exercise for $25,000 and never exercise another day in your life? Raise your hand. Okay, one person, how much do you exercise? I don't really like exercise. So the rest of you, how about $50,000? How many of you would stop? You see, so I'm doing this because I want those of you who don't exercise to think, what is it about this exercise? Well, it's shown to have enormously beneficial effects. The idea with stress management is if you can change the stressors that are impacting you, it's about a balance between resources and demands. Resources and demands. Dick Lazarus, my teacher at Berkeley, one of my favorite people in my academic career, really emphasized that in his thinking about stress and coping. So you want to change the demands, just like with Jessica's caregiver's situation. You want to reduce the demands on the caregiver, right? That's the first step. But then when you can't change the outside world and the demands, then you've got to change how you think about it. You have to have a different perspective. You have to look at things a little differently. You have to be more stress hardy. You have to see a challenge and not a threat. There are a lot of ways that we can think about things differently. And then farther downstream, you have to get the stress hormones out of your system. The catecholamines are racing through your body, and that's where exercise really can play an important role of all kinds. You don't have to be a marathoner to benefit from this. Just some exercise can make a huge difference. Self-compassion is not a new idea. It goes back to the Buddha, I believe, just how we relate to ourselves. Are we compassionate toward ourselves? But Kristin Neff has taken it to a new level in terms of psychological study. How are we responding to ourselves? Are we being compassionate to ourselves when things don't go right, when we're struggling, when we're feeling like, didn't do so well with that patient, or I'm just not feeling very good about myself, or I'm too something? Do we take a stance toward ourselves like we would toward a child, our children, and say, okay, you're not happy right now. Let me just be with that a little bit and see what I can learn. With burnout, you have to pay attention to it. It's an opportunity to, okay, I need to take care of myself. So you have to see like the Chinese characters for crisis, Wei Ji, danger and opportunity. So self-compassion is really, really important for us, especially in these difficult times when we're left by ourselves and we are ending up ruminating a lot. Cognitive reappraisal, that's what I was referring to here a little bit, where we have to think about things a little bit differently. And we know that what's not good is suppression. And I think our pain presenter, the doctor, was really making that point. That just suppressing one's pain doesn't work. We need to really have a different stance. We need to try to get a perspective. I think it's the best way to summarize it. We need a resilient team. If you have a healthy team in which your mission to vision process is in alignment with the team's mission to vision process, is in alignment with the organization's mission to vision process, don't you wish for that? And when it's happening, it's incredibly, incredibly healthy for us as caregivers, incredibly supportive. And what the research is showing, and I write about this in my book, is that when team members feel like we are all acting together toward a purpose, with purpose, it is amazingly beneficial for the team members in terms of their health, psychological health, and the overall effectiveness of the team. Social support. It's one of the most powerful variables in the social sciences. It predicts almost everything. If you have quality social support, and it takes many forms for all of us, it can be that kind of big ear that you have. Do you have someone you could call at any moment and say, hey, I'm having a bad day? This is the best support group you could possibly have. Look around, and even though we have masks on, make eye contact with each other. Look around. Don't be anxious about this. We can make eye contact without spreading anything except caring. There we go. Look around. Make eye contact. Yeah. Okay. This is your best support group. Right here in this room, talking to people who are here, and all the online people. I hope you're going to be contacting these people and the other people who are online. And that's what this conference does so beautifully, is bring together social support, create social support, strengthen social support for people doing this profound work. So, think I need to share a little bit about what I'm experiencing with somebody who can understand. And that's when you can get technical appreciation, you can get technical challenge My dear friend Ayala Pines, she was an Israeli researcher who was at Berkeley when I was there. She's written extensively about burnout. One thing she said is that burnout's a failure in the search for meaning, but she also identified the different functions of social support, the ones that I'm talking about now. And I think we need to get many different kinds of social support. We also need to integrate the losses that we have. And back to that study I mentioned with over 1,000 end-of-life clinicians who said number 2 stressor was haven't had time to grieve. That's why more and more we're spending time in hospice and palliative care saying, hey, we need to take a moment and honor these deaths. We need to, for ourselves, to recognize that I have losses as a person working with others in this context. It's very important, and I know you've all experienced this. You come in and someone's died, but you have to get to the next family. You have to get to the next patient. I don't have time. The bed is empty. I've seen that so many times. I go into the room and I go to visit a patient. They're not there. You know that feeling you have in your stomach? It's like, gosh, they've died. And I didn't even know that was going to happen right now. So we need to integrate these losses. We need, just like we're helping bereaved family members integrate the losses that they're experiencing. Now, I want to focus a little bit on 3 special areas that I've worked in. One is balanced empathy, that we need balanced empathy, and that will prevent burnout and strengthen resilience. We also have to find a way to address some of these difficult inner experiences that we have as helpers, and this is something that is also true for bereaved people and anyone dealing with any stressful life event. How do we handle these difficult experiences that we're kind of reluctant to share with others, but I'm going to focus on us as professional caregivers. And then finally, finding meaning and purpose in the work as, I think, probably almost the ultimate stress buffer. Now, to understand balanced empathy, we have to look at what empathy and compassion are, really. So think about empathy as a vicarious experience of another's emotion, or you're kind of living it with them, you're suffering with them. Compassion is different. Compassion is an emotional response to another's suffering, so you're empathically engaged, but then this other response develops. It's an emotional response with the desire to take action to alleviate that suffering. You're being moved by another's suffering and wanting to help. Okay, so there's a connection there. Empathy leads to compassion, but it doesn't always, and that's what I want to talk about. How can we understand empathy? Well, one way is Carl Rogers' definition. And I think Carl had absolutely the best way to describe this for us as caregivers. To sense the client's inner world of private personal meanings as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as if quality. That is empathy. So as if, but without it being seen as your own experience, without identifying with their experience. I think that'll make sense for you. So think about this continuum of emotional involvement that goes from too close, overly involved over here to burned out, distant, uninvolved. And some of you, how many of you are new in this field? Like this is your first year or your second year doing this work. Okay, boy, you really have a lot of really great people around you who can give you support and be mentors for you. So you're a little bit at risk right away to be over here all the time. Everything is an emergency. And we've all seen this with junior people coming in who are so excited and everything's an emergency, but you can't stay in that state forever. And then you can come over here and feel like bad about yourself because you're feeling burned out, distant, uninvolved. But the trick is to be in this middle position where we're balanced, where we can be more involved emotionally, and then we can be less involved when we need to too. So we can have more self-care, more focus on ourselves. And then over here we can give a little bit more, because sometimes you have to give a lot more than you planned for in this work. It's not as simple as making widgets for Larry Ellison in Silicon Valley. So at each end, and here's the critical idea that I want to really bring home today. At each end of this continuum is an experience of personal distress. Now, personal distress isn't my term, it's in the research literature, hundreds of studies. But the idea is this: each end of the continuum, you can experience personal distress. Right? Personal distress disrupts empathy. We have a battle going on, or a competition, between personal distress and compassion. So think about that for a moment. Personal distress and compassion competing. Compassion counteracting personal distress. They activate different parts of the brain. So if you go into personal distress when you're empathically engaged, that's going to activate the pain center in the brain. If you go into a compassionate state, it activates the pleasure center in the brain. And all kinds of good things. Right? Connects you up with the things you want to be connected with, positive thoughts and all that. So compassion is competing with personal distress. So we have to reduce personal distress to increase the likelihood that empathy results in compassion. Then we have the innate altruism, empathy, compassion, helping process unfolding, and that's the magic. That's helping others is a natural unfolding of the healthy human heart and brain. But we have to have compassion winning out. Okay? And what we're learning is that if compassion wins out and you are able to sustain your sense of purpose in the work, it's one of the best buffers against stress. Yes, you can be overwhelmed with demands and too many things going on and difficult situations and patient loads and situations that are overwhelming, yes, for a day or two or a week. In fact, how many of you are formally burned out? How many of you would identify as, I'm formally burned out, but I've returned to the work? Raise your hands. Don't be shy about it. Yeah, you know, well, that's a badge of honor, isn't it? Because you had to be on fire to burn out. It's one of the memes in the burnout literature from day one is that you had to be on fire to burn out. So if you burned out, you've been on fire. So at each end of this continuum, we have personal distress. So this is my helper's pit metaphor that I always share, and those of you who've heard me speak before have seen it, but people find it so helpful. So we have to find a way to reach into the pit and help the person we're helping out of the pit who's distressed without falling into the pit ourselves. Right? You have to find a way. Now, what do you hold on to? You hold on to your faith, your communication skills, your exercise, your mindfulness, your social support, all those things that sustain you, that allow you to keep balance in the moment so that you can reach in. Because people in pits do not need their helper in the pit with them. It becomes a support group, doesn't it, at that point? Yes, I'm very distressed too. No, that's not good. It doesn't help. So you've got to find a way to reach into the pit. And here's my incredible animation from Silicon Valley. I came here just to show you this. Isn't it amazing? Yeah, that's pretty wow, isn't it? Yeah, that animation. You get the idea. You don't want to have this happen. This is a problem. And people who are in the pits, in these kind of pits, do not need their helper in the pit with them. We've got another problem, which I'm not going to go into at great length, but in the bigger picture that we're dealing with worldwide right now, it's hard not to reference it. You know, it's Bunny bringing up the Texas massacre and the war in Ukraine and all that's happening in our world today. There's a phenomenon we've identified, which is compassion collapse. We're numb to numbers. I know that one day I heard something about 10,000 people somewhere in Ukraine had died or something. And I remember the next day it was really hard for me to have my usual high level of empathy and compassion. I kind of had to back away a little bit. I was just overwhelming. But then I saw a mother carrying her child through these bombed streets and holding her like this, and then I was back on board compassionately. I'm just confessing that it had an impact on me, and I realized it. I thought, yes, compassion collapse. It was too much. 1 million deaths? How do we take that in? I can't really take it in. It's too much. And it's hard for us, so we have to struggle to find ways to retain our compassion and develop it in the modern world. Now, one of the areas that I work in and do research in is self-concealment. And so this is when we conceal personal information that we perceive as negative or distressing. So it's something about ourselves or experiences we don't like. My basic view of this is, we seek connection but we fear rejection. This is a fundamental kind of human trait. Donald Winnicott, who's a famous psychoanalyst, said, "It's a joy to be hidden, but a disaster not to be found." You know, and of course there are some secrets we possess, there are other secrets that possess us. I'm not saying all secrets are bad at all. It's just the ones that really wear on us, that bother us, that trouble us. And you know, it's important to recognize the difference between that and privacy. But the research on this began with Jamie Pennebaker, who looked at bereaved people who had not disclosed any of their experiences of bereavement. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we disclose our difficult experiences to everyone or anyone, only to a trusted confidant. But the act of not discussing or confiding the event with another may be more damaging than having experienced the event per se, which is a pretty profound statement. Dan Wegner at Harvard researched suppression, and I've already alluded to this, saying you want to cognitively reappraise, not suppress. You don't want to push things down. I think our presentation on pain really made that point. And he asked people to not think about a white bear. And they stopped thinking about the white bear. But guess what happened? The white bear came back to their minds. Then they suppressed it. Then it came back. Then they suppressed it. It came back. I think this is familiar to all of us when you're trying to suppress something. It's called the ironic rebound effect in research. So we have to find a way to engage with our experience to avoid what we call experiential avoidance that can create problems. Michael Slepian at Columbia is having a new book come out now on secrets, his research, which is large N kind of research. He had in his studies, one side of the room or one experimental group think of a big secret, that's all, he said. The other side, think about a small secret. And then he had them estimate the slope of this hill using this exact photo. The people who thought about a big secret, just thinking about a big secret in their lives, thought it was steeper than the group who thought about a small secret. Isn't that amazing? And they thought that things were heavier when they had them estimate the weight, and they thought that distances were farther, etc., across a whole bunch of physical measurements and perceptual measurements. So somehow secrets are very burdensome. My scale is used now in over 200 empirical studies. It's shown to correlate with depression, anxiety, physical symptoms, on and on and on. And when secrets are really a problem is when the urge to reveal conflicts with the urge to conceal. I mean, the urge to reveal is right there. It's ancestral plane behavior. When you have a trouble, just like a child, I want to tell someone, you know, Bunny, I lost my cell phone. I want to tell you, you know, I need help, right? Immediately. But if it's something I have shame keeps things hidden. I won't tell you about that experience that I feel shame with. So, you know, to get the distinction between public and private, well, here's a little example I give. How many of you, let's say we crumple or fold our toilet paper. How many of us, let's just say there's just two choices, okay? How many of us crumple? Raise your hand, everybody be involved. Raise your hand if you crumple your toilet paper. Raise your hand. Okay, let's see. How many of you fold? Okay. How many of you said, I don't want to even answer this stupid question? Because it's ridiculous. Yeah, exactly. I refuse to answer that. Yeah, you know, but look at what just happened. Didn't you look around and say, is everybody else folding? Is everybody else crumpling? Or you're thinking like, I crumple, it's kind of creative, but at the same time, it's, you know, a little bit disorganized. And then the folders are going, yeah, but it's neat, but then I'm a little OCD. And then if you're sitting next to your friend and your friend crumples and you fold, it's totally stupid. But yet we have this evaluation that's going on constantly. Self-esteem regulation is happening constantly in all our work. Now, what I've really, and you know, one other finding in my research is, you know, with suicide and suicidality in youth, which is another huge issue we have. We had 2 suicides at my university in December. I was very involved in that because I'm the grief and loss person on campus. 24,000 college students attempt suicide each year. 24,000 college students. 1,100 of them die through suicide, and they keep it secret. And my scale predicts this very well, and there's a lot on this now in the literature. Also concealment during a pandemic. Social distancing practices, COVID symptoms, all these things are being concealed. We're researching it, showing that there's so many ways that things COVID related are concealed. COVID shame is a huge thing in medicine right now. Now, you know, I have researched specifically secrets that we have as helpers and looked at feelings of inadequacy, one-way giving, too many demands, anger, things we keep secret. Here's some helper secrets that people have shared with me. When I'm leaving the bedside of someone who is dying and they are near the end of the dying process, I'm not sure what to say into their ear. I don't know what words to use. This is an experienced hospice person. Do I tell them to have a safe journey, that they'll be remembered, that their family will always hold them in their heart, that there's hope? What do I say as I leave their side? Someone else wrote, I had a difficult patient who became so angry at my attempts to help her, she spit in my face. Without thinking, I spit back in her face. I know, shocking, isn't it? But that was just a terrible moment for her. She goes on to say, I could have died with shame. I was there to make this more comfortable for her, and I failed miserably. I don't think anyone else would have reacted so impulsively. Well, I was in Australia lecturing, and a bereavement person said, and she said this openly in the group, she said, I was working with, after we shared our secrets, she said, I'll say mine out loud. We wrote them on cards. She said, I was working with a mother whose son died through suicide via hanging himself. And as the mother was leaving the room, she said, hang in there. And you can imagine how mortified she was. She cried as she shared this. She said, I can't believe I said that. I still can't get over it. And she said, I don't know if she heard me. I hope she didn't, but I think she did. I think you can all relate to that. Didn't you feel that in your body? I just could sense how painful that would be. Sometimes I'm so angry at a patient who's very demanding, wanting something every 5 minutes, putting the call light on excessively. Then I feel guilty because they're the ones who are suffering and dying, and I'm the fortunate one. I'm healthy and able to go on with my life. Then I say to myself, how could you be so uncaring and selfish? You should be doing something else like working at Kmart. And I have to share my my top 10 signs of burnout that I have always mention, because my number 10 top 10 sign of burnout is shopping at Kmart feels like you're taking good care of yourself. Number 9, frequently startle you by waking you up during home visits. Number 8, you find yourself saying, you think you've got problems, lady? 7, you become aware of a reluctance to go to work and you don't go to work, even in your own home. Number 6, you accidentally drop your cell phone from a high bridge. Number 5, you jump after the cell phone. Number 4, giggling during team meetings. Number 3, not giggling during team meetings. Number 2, eating an entire bag of Dorito chips while making bereavement phone calls. Number 1, who cares about this list anyway? I think Letterman throws it, doesn't he? He throws it away. Okay, so helper secrets. We have to share these experiences with confidants and get them out of our system, and then we get some perspective on them and see that overcome the fallacy of uniqueness, the belief that I alone have these experiences. We have to integrate and transform loss and trauma, and I think that the presentation on pain really was, and we've heard throughout the day, we can take this pain, we can transform it into compassion, into meaningful experience. We have to pay attention. We have to experience our experience, and that's so critical. And we have to find meaning and purpose in the work, and there's a new term on the block, eudaimonia, but it's actually ancient from the Greeks. And what this term meant is referred to a deeper form of happiness connected to our values beyond what a good Netflix show can do, maybe even retail therapy. So it's becoming clear that connecting, and this is based on research, not just my thoughts on it, to real purpose in our lives and our work, committing ourselves to something beyond our own gratification provides a tremendous buffer against stress. So finding meaning is something we need to be doing. But as one doc said to me, there's lots of meaning in this work, I just don't have time to find it. So, one of the things to reflect on as we're trying to connect with purpose is what brought us in. And I call these mission moments, and I want to read just a few. These are the moments when you say, okay, That's why I'm doing this. That's where I find meaning. That's why I put up with all this. That's why I go on. That's why I remain committed. As I sat with a family member whose father had just taken his own life, they said they could not have gotten through it without me. I had made a difference. Just take that in. Just imagine being that caregiver. Here's a beautiful one. A 5-year-old child who was in isolation for months while undergoing a stem cell transplant asked, with obvious pride at his verbal mastery, "Are you a psychologist?" When I answered in the affirmative, he responded, "Every boy needs a psychologist to see his feelings." Isn't that sweet? Tommy was a 3-year-old. During the last 12 hours of his life, I encouraged his mom that it was okay to sit and hold him and rock him. After he died, she was able to sit and rock him for an hour as family members came and said goodbyes, and we had a prayer circle around them. This is a life-changing event for this nurse or social worker, I'm not sure which, or a pastor, or rabbi, or just a spiritual care person. The moment that validated my being with hospice was with a patient dying at home with her family. Over 20 people with her being held, touched, sung to as a family with piano being played, and pastor present to share spiritual needs. I made a difference in a comfortable, peaceful death. I think the greatest gift you can give anyone is the death they want. I felt inspired by the death we saw this morning that in the Caregiver movie, that they really gave her the death she wanted, and that is the gift that is beyond words. Upon meeting a new patient, an elderly woman, small and frail, I was preparing to explain how I could assist her. Before I could begin my presentation, she lifted her hand slightly and then spoke clearly, and I love this, "So you are to be my warrior." You know, I had an experience a couple of years ago, maybe right after I was here, with a woman, Kathy, who came into my office in my clinical practice and with an oxygen tank. Clearly, I talked to her doctor. She gave me permission. I worked with him, and she was terminal, but she wasn't ready to accept hospice care. And so I met with her. I met with the family. We had the curative to palliative kinds of conversations. I kept working with her on how can the family get the most support possible? How can you die at home? Because just like Jessica said, 80% of Americans want to die at home, but 80% don't. They die in institutions, is the reality. And I had a moment with her. I visited her in the home several times, and the last time, just before she died, I was standing there, and you've all had this experience if you've worked with dying patients, but it really touched me. She reached out for my hand. I didn't, want to reach out. She reached out for my hand. I held her hand, and she said 6 words. She smiled, and she said, "A good life, a good death." And I'll never forget that. And when I was driving home, if I had died on the way home and I realized I was dying, I probably would have died happily. Of course, I got over that very soon by the time I got home as just who I am, but I'm not there yet. We know from research, I know cross-sectional research, reverse causation and all that for the researchers, but what we're finding is a high sense of purpose in life is associated with a reduced risk for all-cause mortality and cardiovascular events. That's some serious stuff. A strong correlation exists between the well-being, happiness, health, and longevity of people who are emotionally and behaviorally compassionate. This is great for us, so long as they are not overwhelmed by helping tasks. So we have to find balance. We have to find the balance. And where can we look? Well, for inspiration, we can look to Mother Teresa. There is joy in transcending self to serve others. Martin Luther King, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? And he had a photo of Gandhi in his office. And then Schweitzer, I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I know, the only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve. I'd like to read that like 8 times, kind of reinforce the idea. He also said, if you lose your reverence for any part of life, you've lost it for all of life. Yet here he is choking this fawn. That's a joke. Okay. So, sorry, Albert. We have the nurse in the Ukraine And I think we're all watching that. We're all amazed by the courage of these people who are enduring hardships that are hard to even imagine what they're going through, with their homes bombed, they're carrying their children to another place, everyone out of school, everyone dislocated. Absolutely horrific. And I don't need to reference the Holocaust, to bring that point home, because it's not unlike it. I find that them invading and saying that they were denazifying Ukraine, absolutely the most horrendous, sickening thing I've ever heard in my life, when they're doing exactly what the Nazis did. But we are in a situation where I think Paul Ehrlich and Robert Ornstein say it so beautifully. All of us, citizens of every nation, are now in the same family, are now in the same boat, walking the same tightrope, like it or not. The worst problems of the human predicament are common to all of us, from climate disruption, loss of biodiversity, and poisoning of the environment, to pandemics, gross economic inequities, and the threat of nuclear war, which was just raised with Russia. Our tightrope is a line from humanity's past to its future. What can guide us? I'm saying that compassion can guide us, and that compassion can be a stress buffer. It can counteract personal distress, which we have to control for. And maybe this shock that the world has had, this new awareness of loss and mortality, could help strengthen the connection between empathy and compassion, because that sense of loss, I think, underlies and motivates compassion. We have to be in touch with that to have compassion activated in us. But when you look at compassion, the word, look at it carefully, and you see several things in it. You see passion, and you see compassion, and you see compass. So I think compassion is the compass that can guide our passion into the future. Albert Bandura is one of the leading thinkers in psychology. He was the most cited psychologist in the 20th century. And we had Al down to speak at our conference at Santa Clara. I had him down a few times, and I asked him, well, what kind of advice would you give people? Because he was the person who first studied and identified self-efficacy, the sense of confidence. And that's what I think we need to have. We need to have a sense of purpose, a sense of confidence in doing this work. And I said, well, what would you say to people? I wanted to get his advice. He's probably the most famous psychologist. And he said, just don't let them wear you down. Sometimes you just have to be tough. You have to hang in there. And sometimes that's a struggle, but I think we've all been doing it. That's why you're here. That's how you got here today. You're tough, you're resilient, you're looking for new ideas, you're looking to be with people who are doing the work with you. So I think, we're following his advice. He also wrote at the bottom of this poster we had, to Dale, may the efficacy force be with you. And I think, let's take that message from Al, may the efficacy force be with us. I write about this in my book. I say, no matter how many resilience-enhancing forces we employ, and by the way, I want to go back one moment to say, think about how you have made it through these 2 years. What has been good for you in terms of strengthening your resilience? You do more of that. Look at that. Think about it. Think how you can increase it, because it's working. Whatever is working for you, do more of that. But whatever we do, stressors at work will still sometimes challenge us to our limits. We'll inevitably be weary at times. Who isn't weary? But if we counter exhaustion with vigor, distress with moral courage, moral distress with moral courage, and our suffering as helpers with its restorative meaning, we can transform and transcend stress. Restorative meaning, we can transform and transcend stress, fulfill our purpose in the work, and live a life aligned with cherished values. I always end my talks with this quote. I begin my book with it. It's from George Bernard Shaw. And he wrote, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you're thrown on the scrap heap." I love that. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clot of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I've got hold of for the moment. And I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. So think of that. Think of your good deeds and your caring. Think of them rippling across the generations. And I really mean, have a little mental picture of that. That daughter you see caring, that sees you caring for her mother so lovingly and with such grace and skill, will become the next great nurse or minister or therapist. The children you help say goodbye to their beloved parent will remember that moment, and at their own death, bring their family together to say their own goodbyes. I really believe, you're changing our culture, you're changing how we live, how we die. It will go on and on long after we leave this place we call home. That's your legacy. And maybe that's where hope truly resides. Compassion and caring we are finding, proving it, are at the very core of being human. This is the inner light, the splendid torch you have hold of in your hands that can pass on to future generations. And I think with it, you bring light when it's dark and warmth when it's cold. So to make the most of this time here, and I think we've been doing that all day with kindred spirits who share on the journey. And as I like to say, sally forth, an old-time saying, which the dictionary reminds me means to leave a safe place, which this truly is, in a brave or confident way in order to do something difficult. So thank you for our time together in this safe place, and thank you for all that you do. Thank you very much. And under an hour.
Thank you, Dr. Larson. That was inspiring. So the links to the evaluation will soon be on the screen, and they will be open. The evaluation will be open for about 12 hours for you to complete for the continuing education credit. If you are seeking credit for social work, please be sure to sign out at the registration booklet in which you signed in. You received a sticky note that was of a certain color. Please return to that book to sign out. The URL and the QR code that will be handed out to you on the way out will also appear here on the screen. You can take a photograph of it with your smartphone. You can scan the QR code with your smartphone and complete the evaluation in the next 12 hours. The certificates will be sent to you within 7 days. Thank you for attending.